share the screen. There it is. Give it another second for others to log in and for YouTube to finish doing its thing so that I can get the page formatted properly for the comments and other interactions. All right. Not too bad. Sometimes takes longer, sometimes not too bad. Okay, just give it another little bit. The YouTube live stream always is slightly delayed, which means it takes people time to get the announcement. And then once having gotten the announcement, it takes them a while to log in. And then that, can delay their participation. But let me go ahead and do a little bit of housekeeping for our upcoming calendar. As anybody that is watching this live or near to the time that it was originally recorded will know, we are in the month of Elul, the month of preparation for our celebration of Rosh Hashanah, along with the other Yamim Noraim, the other high holidays. That means that we're going to be going on a hiatus quite soon. We will be having our class next week. That is September 2nd. And we will have, and that will be our last class until we get to October 7th. So September 2nd, yes, we have class, but 9, 16, 23, 30 are all wiped out because of the holidays and the other activities that go on when the holidays are happening and all of the other crunch that can happen during this time of year. So hopefully you will still find plenty of time to continue your own studies as well as participate in your community's celebration of these wonderful Chagim. But we will not be meeting together for this class during that block. Once again, next week, September 2nd, yes, we have a class, but then from then we are on hiatus until October 7th. Good. And that gave us time to let people log in. So let's go ahead and get down to work. We are picking up, as I promised, with the concept of false messiahs. Now, as I also mentioned before, false messiah is the general term that is used for describing the different people who have had the title Messiah attached to them. Unfortunately, the term false really does lean in modern English usage towards a lie. But we will have to decide for ourselves whether or not the different people who have gained this term by history were lying when they or others proclaimed them to be the Messiah, or whether they were false in the sense of mistaken, that they thought this was the right person, they thought this was the right moment, but it turns out they were wrong. So we're going to keep using the term false Messiah, but please understand that the term is not used to discredit their attempts, although definitely some of them deserve discrediting, but as a blanket term, it's simply meaning messiahs that weren't the Messiah, people who had the title for one reason or another and turned out to not be the Messiah. So, oh, hello. Why is it showing subtitles? I don't want that. Let's hold on a second. My Google is being very weird in the live stream. So let me just see what possible reason it thinks that it should be doing that. All of the great features that we get now can just make things. There we are. Close that and turn that off. It's a very useful feature sometimes when I need to listen to a podcast or something. But let's see if that turned it off, because it's going to be very distracting for those watching the YouTube video, and I apologize for it. But let's see whether this actually worked to turn it off. And I'm afraid for everyone else, you're going to have to wait. But I don't really want it to be writing over the top of the text while we're going, because that is very distracting. And it should be gone. Nope, it's still going. What? Ah, all right. The bizarre world of YouTube is making my life complicated. I'm not sure what to tell you about that. For those of you that are watching, I will look into it again when this is over. But for now, we're just going to go on with the class and pretend like Google isn't being completely weird and doing something rather strange. All right. Well, like I said before, oh, no, it's still going. Like I said before, we are looking at these false messiahs not because we think each of them had malicious intent or was bent on deception, but because each of them marked an important part of our history that was centered around the messianic ideal. And the messianic ideal was, of course, the focus of our aspirations for a redeemed world. Judaism, obviously, as we've seen over the many weeks we've studied, puts a great store within this concept of the Mashiach being central to redemption. So we need to find that person. Rambam gave us some guidelines of the checklist of what they need to do, and you can review to last week's and the week before's class to go over that on your own. But basically, they need to actually fulfill the prophecy. And by fulfill the prophecy, we don't mean that they are going to do miracle A or appear in format B, riding a donkey, as some of the midrashim talked about. That is not the end all and be all of proving somebody's messianic status. In fact, as we've seen, even if they perform miracles, even if they tick all the other boxes of appearance, their messianic status is not affirmed until they've actually accomplished what the Messiah needs to accomplish, which is why, as we look through all these different historical characters, we can say incontrovertibly they are false messiahs. That is to say, they did not succeed. And we know they didn't succeed because we can look out our window and see that the world is not yet in a fully redeemed state. It's just not there. And there was no indication, no hint, no whiff of a concept that the Messiah might be a first edition, second edition kind of run with second comings or a follow-up that would happen after their death. No. The Mashiach, as portrayed in the core prophecies and is understood by Judaism for more than 2,000 years, gets one shot. And if they're dead and the world is not redeemed, they were not the Messiah. We will come back to that in some of the more prominent cases that are still bedeviling people to this day when we get near the end of our historical survey. But let's go ahead and look at a prime example of somebody who was a potential candidate, actually had backing, but we know was not the Messiah because they lost and they are dead. All right, and that is, of course, Shimon Bar Kokhba, or we'll come on one of his other names in a little bit. Bar Kokhba lived, as you can see, during the 2nd century CE. He lived in the time after the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans, and during the continued Roman occupation, and during the continued Roman subjugation of our people. And he, along with thousands of others, worked together to create a revolution, a revolt against Rome that lasted, as you can see, from around 132 to 135. And by lasted, I mean they were actually successful in establishing their own sovereignty over the land of Israel during that bubble. They successfully kicked out the Roman military that was there, defeating them in battle. They took over the governance of that area, and they were independent for that time period. I say that in quotes because, of course, it is obviously a lull rather than a full victory, which is why there is a 135 at the end after that hyphen, because the Romans come back and they hit with extreme violence and things get even worse. Let's take a look at that from the Roman point of view. This is something that we have very good historical evidence from. from many different sources, but we're going to look at a few Roman sources as well as, of course, mostly Jewish sources. One little disambiguation, as Wikipedia would call it. Make sure that you are in the proper frame of mind that we are in the 2nd century CE. We are not in the 1st century CE. It's not uncommon for people to confuse this revolt with what was called the Jewish War or the Great Revolt against Rome, which happened in 70 CE. That was the revolt that led to the destruction of the Second Temple. That was the revolt that was centered. That was the revolt where you would find the story of Masada, which is very well known to so many people. This is not that war. Even though we are going to end up with a fortress at the end, this is not that war. This is the war that happened 60 some years later and was a second attempt. Well, more than second. It was the second great attempt at throwing off Roman occupation. Jews were known for their revolutionary spirit, to say the least, during this time. There's a reason the Romans built Arc de Triomphe over the victory over us in Rome, because we were a real pain for them. All right, and we can see that clearly here in a letter written to Marcus Aurelius, one of the later emperors of Rome after the Bar Kokhba revolt, and in which this letter reminds him, the God who begat the great Roman race has no compunction in suffering us to faint at times and be defeated and wounded. So he's reminding the emperor that sometimes the Romans do lose, right? Romans at this point have been ascendant for 600 years, give or take. And it might be thought that Rome always wins, but he is reminding them not so. However, in typical arrogance, but always and everywhere he turned our sorrows into success and our terrors into triumphs. But it always works out in the end, Rome eventually wins. Turns out that's not always true because Rome's still not around, but that was the opinion of the time. However, he gives this caution, but not to hark back too far into ancient times, meaning it's not ancient history to get an example of this. I will take instances from your own family. Under the rule of your grandfather, Hadrian, what a number of soldiers were killed by the Jews. So he is reminding Marcus Aurelius that his grandfather, the Emperor Hadrian, had this problem with the Jews, and that the Jews killed a whole lot of Romans, that this was a quite successful attack. And as such, well, maybe they should be bearing that in mind as they are dealing with other situations in the empire. That while it may be true that Rome eventually did triumph, like I said, 135 sits there as a reminder, the fact is Rome paid a heavy price for this. Legions had to be taken from the other end of the empire and moved all the way, which is no small feat, to the land of Israel in order to crush the Bar Kokhba war. So Marcus Aurelius is being reminded that this was a big deal. This was a huge tragedy from the Roman point of view. And even though they won in the end, they paid very dearly for it. Now, I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of the Bar Kokhba War. There are many, many good books and articles out there that can detail that in much more detail than I'm going to do in this class. But that is because I want to focus on what Judaism learned as both a religion, which is why we're looking at mostly religious texts, and what Judaism learned as a culture from the Bar Kokhba experience. So with that aside, and please do look into the history of the war itself. It is fascinating what happened, and especially the archaeology in modern times that has helped corroborate and fill in many other elements. It is absolutely amazing what we now know and what happened and what we could achieve and how we failed. But it's how we tell the story that matters most for today's discussion. So we begin in the Mishnah, and this is in Ta'anit. And this Masechet, this section of Mishnah, is talking about the different fasts of our calendar. And in particular, as you'll see, we are looking at Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of Av, which passed just a few weeks ago, and is, of course, the most severe day of fasting and mourning in our calendar. And with good reason, as the Mishnah explains. 5 calamitous matters. Again, the bold are the words of the Mishnah. The light font is the words of the commentator trying to help make actual sentences, which we can then read. 5 calamitous matters occurred to our forefathers on the 9th of Av. It was decreed upon our ancestors that they would all die in the wilderness and not enter Eretz Israel. So that's disaster number 1. We know that it was on the 9th of Av that God told the assembly, after the report of the spies and their willingness to despair, that that's it. You guys aren't going to Israel. It's going to be for your kids. Number 2, the temple was destroyed for the first time. That happened in the days of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylonian Empire. And 3, for the second time, it was destroyed, that time by Romans. That was our 70 CE Great War. And Beitar was captured. That's Bar Kokhba. And the city of Jerusalem was plowed as a sign that it would never be rebuilt. So you'll notice the last 3 here are all related to the Romans, and the last 2, the capture of Beitar and the plowing of Jerusalem, are related and a direct result of the Bar Kokhba revolt. So the 9th of Av, as we know, has had many, many tragedies. You can look up full lists online of all the other things in history that have happened since on that same day. But we of course are going to focus on Beitar in particular, because that was the final moment where any question of the status of Bar Kokhba as Messiah was resolved, unfortunately, in the negative. Okay, so let's back up and find out what else we know about this time period and how it's been immortalized and understood within our people. So we turn to the Babylonian Talmud, the Bavli, Gittin 57a. It is similarly taught in a Breita. Remember, Breitas are other texts from the time of the Mishnah, but not official parts of the Mishnah, that Rabbi Eliezer the Great says, there are 2 rivers in Yadayim Valley in that region, one flowing one way and one flowing the other way. And the sages estimated that in the aftermath of this war, meaning the war of Bar Kokhba, these rivers were filled with 2 parts water to 1 part blood. That is to say, the slaughter was so terrible in the both final slaughter at Beitar as well as the reprisals that took place after this revolt, which were much more severe than the reprisals that took place after 70 CE, that the water in these rivers was now 1/3 blood, which is just, gallons and gallons of blood. Likewise, it was taught in a Breita, for 7 years, the Gentiles harvested their vineyards that had been soaked with the blood of Israel without requiring any additional fertilizer. So just to add a little extra hyperbole here, it is our blood that was washing across the land that allowed their vineyards to be fruitful because of the magnitude of the slaughter. And in terms of cultural memory and in terms of historical impact, you have to understand that the calamity that happened at the end and after the Bar Kokhba revolt was the worst tragedy that had happened to our people throughout the entirety of their history. Yes, we can talk about the inability to go into the land of Israel. We can talk about the destruction of Temple 1 and Temple 2, and we can talk about the exiles that happened at Temple 1, and then the problems that happened after Temple 2 were destroyed. But as far as a per capita loss of life, of destruction of our people, of a destruction of our ability to live on our land, nothing compares to Bar Kokhba. The only thing that can come close now, of course, is the Shoah, is the Holocaust, which created an even greater loss of life during the 20th century. But prior to the 20th century, there was no catastrophe that killed as many people, destroyed as many communities, and uprooted our people from their own way of life as much as the aftermath of Bar Kokhba, which is this little sample from Gittin is trying to let us know. So the impact of Bar Kokhba on us was even worse than in the letter in Marcus Aurelius made it sound for the Romans. Yes, lots of Romans died, but they won and, everything went back to normal. For us, on the other hand, this was quite literally a bloodbath. And that, of course, is going to, well, it has been imprinted within the way we recall the story. You'll note that we are not talking about the glory of Bar Kokhba, of his amazing victory over the Romans, of the fact that he did establish an independent state and minted his own coins and had all of the other things that were going for him in his accomplishments. That's not being held on to as the remembrance of Bar Kokhba. However, whether you know it or not, there is another remembrance of Bar Kokhba that is recited, well, for most people daily, for many people multiple times a day, depending upon what their menu is serving. And that is in Birkat HaMazon. The Birkat HaMazon has a number of different sections. This is the full Birkat HaMazon that we do, not the abbreviated versions or the ones that we do for foods that are not a set meal or not based around lechem, around bread. But halacha and Birkat HaMazon another day. But in the full version of Birkat HaMazon, there are 4 distinct blessings. And historically, they are considered to each have marked different historical periods. Well, the first one is simply that we should bless every time we have eaten. And that's our first blessing. The second blessing is to bless specifically for the blessing of the land of Israel itself that allows us to sustain ourselves. The third blessing revolves around Jerusalem. And the fourth blessing, well, the fourth blessing just talks about sort of goodness. Well, that has a very dark story behind it that ties into Bar Kokhba. So as the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud says, Rav Huna said, when the slain of Beitar were permitted to be buried, the good and the benefactor was fixed. The good, that they did not decompose, the benefactor, that they were permitted for burial. All right, so what is the good and the benefactor? Well, these are one of those lines that is best understood in our Hebrew, because that's where we say them most often. So Hamelech Hatov Hametiv Lakol is the phrase that is being referred to. Well, just Hatov is good, but most modern versions of Birkat HaMazon, and there have been many over the centuries, append the word Hamelech. So it's the king, the one who is good, the one that brings good, seeing the root of Hatov and Hametiv are being linked here. So we are thanking God for being the good and for being the one that makes good. Well, what is the good that we are really talking about here? And what is it that God made good that is being thanked for? Well, the rabbis say that this paragraph was added specifically in the year 135, because that was the moment when we were finally allowed to bury the dead. That one of the punishments for the Bar Kokhba revolt was, after that final stronghold, the final fortress of Beitar was overtaken, the people that were slaughtered and killed were not allowed to be buried. That was part of the Roman punishment, that we would not be able to dignify our dead with a burial. And of course, that was greatly distressing to the nation. Eventually, however, the Romans did allow us to bury them. And according to Yerushalmi, in the meantime, the bodies of the dead did not decompose. This was a blessing that God gave to allow them to be at least buried with more dignity. And of course, they were eventually allowed to be buried at all. And that is the second half of this. So every time we come across this line, Hatov v'hametiv lakol, we are reminded of the Bar Kokhba revolt. And we are reminded of the bloody and painful consequences at the end of that revolt. So this is not a false messiah that has faded from Jewish life. This is, in fact, an episode that is bolted into our daily rituals, whether you knew it or not, and as a reminder that we are meant to reflect upon it throughout our daily life, even if we don't explicitly mention Bar Kokhba or the deeds of that time by name. This allusion is designed specifically to trigger that memory. And as we go through, I think you'll see why the rabbis felt it was important for this memory to be held on to. All right, so Turning to the Mishneh Torah, this is Rambam's compilation, we begin to get a little extra insight. On the 9th of Av, 5 tragedies occurred. We talked about this in our regular Mishnah, but Rambam is going to give us some more detail where we need it for today. It was decreed that the Jews in the desert would not enter Eretz Israel. The first and the second temples were destroyed. A large city named Beitar was captured. Thousands and myriads of Jews inhabited it. They were ruled by a great king, whom the entire Jewish people and the leading sages considered to be the Messianic king. The city fell to the Romans, and they were all slain, causing a national catastrophe equivalent to that of the temple's destruction. On that day, designated for retribution, the wicked Tinius Rufus plowed the site of the temple and its surroundings, thereby fulfilling the prophecy, Zion will be plowed like a field, taken from the prophet Micah. So, as you can see, Rambam did not feel the need to further elucidate the destruction of the first and second temples or our failure to be able to go into the land of Israel. Those are well-known, well-established, but the capture of Beitar is a concept that in his day, which was 1,000 years ago from us, 800 years after the fall of Beitar, for him, was less well-known. And he felt it necessary to give a little extra information. And you will notice his formulation of this, that during that time, there was somebody that was considered to be a messianic king, and that person was considered to be a messianic king even by the Hachamim, even by the sages, the great rabbis of that period, as well as the nation as a whole. So this was a false Messiah as understood by Judaism. This was somebody who had reached a level of messianic approval by even the normally reluctant nation and sages. So obviously this bears a great deal more investigation. Rambam, of course, is not going into history, so this is only a taste, but we can reflect in the works of the Yerushalmi in much more detail of what was going on and how we now remember this in greater detail. So let's go ahead and take a look at the Yerushalmi's main passage dealing with this story. As always, I bring the full citations so that you can go and look up more about these topics because there is so much more to learn. Rabbi Shimeon Bar Yochai stated, Akiva, my teacher, used to preach. There appeared a star out of Jacob. That's taken from Numbers 24:17. And there appeared Koziba out of Jacob. All right, so what's happening here is a play on words. This is letting us know that Bar Kokhba's original name was Bar Koziba. Now, this is odd because Bar Koziba basically sounds an awful lot like the word that would mean the liar, the son of a lie. And indeed, that is how he is referred to in some other texts, which is a sort of hindsight reflection that this was a lie that we all bought into that led to so much devastation. But at the time, Shimon Bar Yochai is saying that Akiva is using the similarity of name between Koziba with the Hebrew word kochba, that means star, and since that phrase in Numbers was already used as a term for the kingliness of the Messianic age, Akiva was using it to basically say Koziba is the king, Koziba is the Messiah. And in fact, we make this explicit. When Rabbi Akiva saw Bar Koziba, he said, "This is King Messiah, Melech HaMoshiach," right? This is the King Messiah. Rabbi Yochanan ben Torta said to him, Akiva, grass will grow from your jaws, and still David's son will not have come. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Torta disagreed. He is trying to remind in a very sharp retort that you may want this guy to be the Messiah. You may even believe that he is the Messiah. But I hate to break it to you, Rabbi Akiva, but you and I will both be long dead and buried. The euphemism of grass will grow from your jaws is basically pushing up daisies, that you will be underground and buried before the Mashiach will have arrived. This ain't him. Now, why would we think he's not him? And why did people think he was him? Well, let's see what the clues are within the section here from Yerushalmi. There was Ben Koziba, who had 200,000 with him missing a finger. All right, so just make sure you understand this. This is not a mistype. It means that in his army, there were 200,000 men that were missing a finger, that had a finger removed from their hands. The sages sent, "How long will you turn Israel into defective persons?" And he told them, how would it be possible to test them? All right, so understand again in the very laconic style of the Talmud, it's not going to give you a lot of words, but it gives you enough. Basically, what Koziba would say, if you want to join my army, you have to prove your bravery. If you want to prove your bravery, cut off a finger. That will show your bravery and your loyalty, and then I will be able to count on you. And so 200,000 people got out a knife and whack, cut off one of their fingers to pass this test, to be able to prove that they were worthy of this position in the army. The sages weren't happy with this, that he was making the people maim themselves, and that this was just a shanda. This is a shame. It's a travesty to have people mutilate themselves as some form of military entrance exam. And yes, in case you're wondering, there are other cultures and groups throughout the world that have used similar forms of self-mutilation as a way of proving their participation and their indelible mark as belonging to a group, as a way of establishing loyalty. And we have an example from our own past as well. But he takes it very practically. Look, I got to test people. I got to make sure they're fit for the army. So what am I supposed to do? The sages, of course, have a much better idea. They said to him, anyone who riding on his horse cannot uproot a cedar of Lebanon should not be enrolled in your army. All right, so basically, they gave him a different sort of military test, which was have somebody gallop by and grab a cedar and pull it out of the ground. And if they can't do that, then they're not strong enough to be in your army. If they can do that, you don't need to cut fingers off, right? This is enough of a proof of their strength and their ability. And apparently he took their advice, and he had 200,000 of either kind. Now, like we saw when we were reading Rambam's explanation of metaphor and analogies, we do not have to take the number of 400,000 soldiers, literally. That would have been inconceivable. Nor do we have to take the idea of somebody riding by and pulling up a fully grown cedar as being a literal description. The idea that there would be 200,000 people that could uproot an actual giant tree is, well, it's contemptuous to imagine that you would believe that in a literal fashion, especially because if that were the case, how did the Romans win? Well, we'll come back to that. How did the Romans win at the end? And that's part of the moral of the story. But it is here precisely for that reason, which is to say, Bar Kokhba didn't lose because he didn't have enough strength. Because the rabbis who are telling the story, in addition to giving us the basic outline of the events, don't want us to walk away with the wrong message. The wrong message would be, we lost because we didn't have enough soldiers. We lost because we didn't have enough strength. We lost because we didn't have enough training, enough swords, enough cavalry, enough chariots, whatever we think was defective in our military strategy and within our physical capabilities. Because, of course, if one were to make that claim, one would be saying that God wasn't participating in the fight. And that is going to lead us to our next passage. When he, Bar Kokhba, went out into battle, he said, Master of the world, do not support and do not hinder. Quoting from Psalm 60, did not you, God, neglect us and do not go out with our armies? So essentially, he is paraphrasing in a way from the book of Psalms, the idea that he is just asking God to stay out of it. Why? Well, if God were unhappy with him or the members of his army, then God might make them lose. And if they have to earn God's support, then they likewise might come up short, and then they would lose. So instead, he is essentially making the claim, we have the physical might to win. We don't want God messing it up by adding a moral dimension, by adding a piety test to what we are trying to do. Because if God does that, then all of our fingerless guys and tree ripper guys in the world won't matter. We'll lose because we'll only win or lose based upon God's whim. And this is a portrayal of Bar Kokhba, of course, that is going to be very telling. That he believes that it is through his strength, his might, his army strength, his army's might, that a victory can be achieved. Hopefully you can already begin to see why after the Bar Kokhba revolt, the telling of the story was designed to deliberately highlight the dangers of listening to a demagogue or rabble rouser who would argue that all we need are more people and we can win. All we need are more tanks and we can win. All we need are bigger bombs and we can win. The rabbis did not want that to be the lesson, because if it had been the lesson, then 10 years later, another person would have tried to get a Jewish army together. And then 50 years later, another person and another. And that would have led to the destruction of our people entirely. And we couldn't have that. So we had to learn the right lesson, which is somebody who comes along and says, if you're manly enough, we can win, is missing the point. That the victory ultimately belongs with God, and you're not going to win just because you can yank out a tree. All right. However, they did hold on. But why did they hold on? Was it the strength of Beitar? Was it the wall of the fortress? Was it the might of the soldiers? Well, the rabbis are telling the story because they're not dead, and they have a very different version. I should say, even as I mentioned tongue-in-cheek, that they're not dead, that actually a great many rabbis were murdered after this time, hunted down by the Romans and publicly slaughtered. This is one of the things we reflect upon during the Ela Ezkara section of our Yom Kippur service. But the overall leadership of the people from after the time of Beitar and Bar Kokhba was on the shoulders of the rabbis, not on the shoulders of military warlords and the like. So the rabbis are the ones who survived as the leaders of our people. 3.5 years did Hadrian encircle Beitar. Rabbi Elazar from Modi'in, or Elazar Modi'i, was sitting in sackcloth and ashes, praying every day and saying, Master of the world, do not sit in judgment day, do not sit in judgment today. All right, so we got a lot going on here. Rabbi Eliezer is praying not for victory, but again, similar to Bar Kokhba, just praying that God doesn't have a day where strict judgment will take place, because in strict judgment, we're not actually worthy of the miracles that would be needed for us to overcome the Romans. So Rabbi Eliezer just wants it to be in abeyance, right? No justice today in the true sense of the word, because we'll lose. Now, this is what was keeping the Romans out, was the prayers of Rabbi Eliezer. And Hadrian eventually gets tired of this. Hadrian wanted to go away. Now, a Samaritan, we'll come back to what they are in a minute. Let me give you his plan first. A Samaritan said to him, to the emperor, do not go away, for I know what to do so the city will submit to you. So a Samaritan comes with a plan, and his plan, he believes, will make Beitar fall. And Beitar is the last stronghold of the resistance here. So once Beitar goes down, the war is over. I mean, the war is already basically over, but the armies of Rome don't have to stay encamped. And the Samaritan, well, the Samaritans are an interesting feature, and they are often figures in rabbinic stories of this time period, because they were one of the groups that were in contention with the Jews. We had the Samaritans, we had the early Christians by this point, and then, of course, the Jewish people. And the Romans were often looking for people to work with other than the Jewish leadership, because the Jewish leadership, well, they had revolts, they had wars, they weren't exactly cooperative with the empire. So finding a minority that could then be exploited against the majority has been a tactic for colonizers for all of history. And this is one of the variations that was going on here. We can talk more about who Samaritans were in another class. You can also just look up a basic article on them and you'll be good. So he, the Samaritan, went to the city gates. Some other texts like Eicha Rabbah say he actually entered through the sewers. He entered the city and found Rabbi Eliezer Hamodai standing in prayer. So he is in the middle of the Amidah. He showed himself as if he would whisper into his ear. So essentially, the Samaritan crawls into the city, sneaks into the city. He gets to where Eliezer Hamodai is standing, and Eliezer Hamodai is in the middle of prayer. And the Samaritan comes up behind him and leans in whispering. Now, if you have engaged in the Amidah with a degree of intensity, you'll know that if somebody's moving quietly, they could be standing right behind you and you would never know. And that is what this Samaritan is doing. He is right behind, pretending to be talking to him, and that is his plan. Because what happens is the people of the city saw him and brought him to Ben Koziba. So people see the Samaritan, they identify him as a Samaritan, and they see him talking to Eliezer Hamodai, and so they say, hey, we got a spy here, and they take him to Ben Koziba. They said to him, to Bar Kokhba, we saw this old man turning to your uncle. We saw him whispering to your uncle. So Eliezer Hamodai was Bar Kokhba's uncle. Another important little fact. He asked him, meaning Bar Kokhba asked the Samaritan, what did you say to him, Eliezer Hamodai, and what did he say to you? So he wants to know, you're a spy? What are you talking about? What was your message? The Samaritan answered, if I tell you, the king, Hadrian, will kill me, but if I do not tell you, you will kill me. Like, oh, I'm in between a rock and a hard place here. What am I supposed to do? It's better that the king should kill me, but not you. Basically, you know what? If I have to go, I'd rather let the king do it than you. So I'll tell you what you want to know. So he is making a big statement about how, oh, you're twisting my arm. Oh, what am I going to do? But of course, his plan all along was to have this little speech, to have this little episode. But he has to sell it. He has to make them think that the information they are getting from him through their intimidation is truthful. Because if they don't buy it, well, then what happens won't happen, and then Beitar would not have fallen. So he is now saying, woe is me, I have to confess, because basically, you're here now, you will definitely kill me. The king's not here now. The king will want to kill me, but maybe I can avoid that, and if not, I'd rather let the king do it. Better, more honorable to be killed by a king than to be killed by someone like you. So he tells him, the Samaritan tells Bar Kokhba, this is what I was whispering to the guy, and this is what he told me back. I will make the town submit to the king. He is accusing, or rather confessing, to the idea that Eliezer Hamodai was a double agent, that he was working for Hadrian, that Eliezer Hamodai, the pious and saintly uncle of Bar Kokhba, was in fact a turncoat, and that he was planning to hand the city over to the king. Now, in general, finding someone in the city that is willing to open the gates or do something else to help let somebody in is a big deal. And that is often how sieges were broken, because actually breaking down walls and climbing over the top of them is really, really hard, despite what movies often make you think. And it's much, much easier to just camp outside and let the people inside starve. So when cities have fallen historically, usually it's because of some form of betrayal on the inside, or the starvation thing. So he is basically saying Eliezer Hamodai is trying to sell you out. Ben Koziba came to Rabbi Eliezer HaModai. Basically, he's like, wants to know, is this true? And he said, what did the Samaritan say to you? Oh, he's asking for corroboration. What a good guy. Eliezer HaModai answered, nothing. What did you say to him? He answered, nothing. So that's the Yerushalmi version, which is very terse, very short. Basically, Bar Kokhba asks Eliezer, what's going on? And he says, nothing. Now, from Rabbi Eliezer's point of view, of course, we know nothing happened. He didn't have a conversation. The guy didn't even say anything. He just looked like he was whispering. And of course, Rabbi Eliezer HaModai didn't say anything because either he didn't notice him or because the guy didn't say anything to him. What was he supposed to say back? He wouldn't have had a conversation with someone who wasn't talking to him, especially not during the Amidah, which we do not interrupt except under extraordinary circumstances. So that in the Yerushalmi is all that is said, and then Bar Kokhba kills him. But we get a little bit of a longer explanation from Eicha Rabbah, which I wanted to include here, where Eliezer HaModai gives a slightly longer answer. He said to him, I do not know what he whispered in my ear, and I did not hear anything from him, as I was standing in prayer, and I do not know what he was saying. So we get a stronger emphasis here on the fact that Eliezer HaModai was in the Amidah. And as I've said a few times today, and hopefully you've heard me say it before, that during the Amidah, we have our highest level of kavanah, of concentration, of intention, of focus. And as such, you may be completely unaware of your surroundings. You may have tuned everything out. And in some communities, you may see people will hold their talit over their head as a tool for that. But that's not even necessary if you are fully concentrated on what you are doing, a conversation with God, then everything else kind of fades into the background. So he is being 100% honest. I don't know, right? I was in the middle of my Amidah. Do you think I would break my Amidah to talk to this guy? Do you think that my prayers are so worthless to me that if someone walked up to me and said, hey, what's the weather like today? I'd stop my Amidah to respond. That's not the way it works. So it is an incredibly powerful statement about what was in Rabbi Eliezer HaModai's mind and what was not in Bar Kokhba's mind. Because Bar Kokhba clearly doesn't think along those lines. He doesn't think, oh, well, it was in the Amidah. Of course, he wouldn't have been talking to him. The Samaritan must be lying, because there's no way my uncle would actually turn away from his conversation with God to answer this guy. None of that is in Bar Kokhba's mind in this telling. And that, again, is setting up a template for how we are meant to view Bar Kokhba's character. That this is somebody who really didn't understand where truth strength came from. True strength came from people like Eliezer HaModai, and true strength ultimately comes from God. So the story resumes in both versions. Bar Kokhba kicked him, Eliezer HaModai, and killed him. Immediately there came an unembodied voice, right? We got this bat kol, this sound from heaven that said, quoting from the book of Zechariah, woe, criminal shepherds, people who are bad leaders, who abandon the flock, a sword on his arm and on his right eye, his arm shall dry up and his right eye darken. All right, you may have a strong arm now, you may have a keen eye now, but you are going down. And indeed, you killed Rabbi Eliezer from Modai, the arm of Israel and their right eye. You've already taken it away. Therefore, this man, Bar Kokhba's arm shall dry up and his right eye shall darken. Immediately, Bar Kokhba was taken and Bar Koziba killed. So this worked. This worked perfectly. Bar Kokhba basically killed the only thing that was standing between him and failure, because he fundamentally didn't understand what was standing between himself and failure, because he didn't understand what it would be that would lead them to success. Going back to that idea that all that mattered was the victory through physical means, cutting off fingers was perfectly fine. The idea of all I ask God is that you stay out of it, rather than trying to make himself a better person that would be worthy of God. That is his fundamental flaw. He saw his success as being born and bred purely in the physical world and purely through physical might. And that all he had to do was match Rome, person for person, power for power, And that was how victory would be won. And that is the underlying problem here. The fact that he had successes, as we'll see from some of the other passages, is sort of what made people think that he might be the Messiah. But when we look in hindsight on what his actual mentality was, we can see that those successes, real though they were not born because he was Messiah or because he had the right attitude, but were born because, yes, for a time, he could match the local Roman garrisons, man for man, power for power. But in the end, in a power game, the most powerful is going to win. And that's the problem, is that we're not meant to work in this world to be the most powerful in the power game. If you're playing the power game, you are already losing. You've got to be playing God's game, and that's not based on power, right? Not by might, not by power, but by spirit alone. Again, the message of the prophet Zechariah. All right. All right, so we are going to just read a little bit more for the sake of time, and then we'll continue with this next week. They, the soldiers, came carrying his head to Hadrian. He asked them, who killed them? A Samaritan said to him, I killed him. He said to him, show me his body. He showed him the body of Bar Kokhba. And they found a poisonous snake wrapped around him, around Bar Kokhba. Hadrian said, if God had not killed him, who could kill him? He recited over him, taken from Deuteronomy. The parts that are in lighter font aren't in the original text, but are the full quote from Deuteronomy. How could one have routed 1,000 or two put 10,000 to flight unless their rock had sold them? God had given them up. So essentially what Hadrian is saying by quoting our Torah is that ultimately our defeat wasn't because of a tricky Samaritan. Our defeat was not because of somebody cutting off the head of Bar Kokhba. That Bar Kokhba died because a snake bit him. And that snake bit him because God sent the snake. And God wouldn't have let the snake get him, or the Samaritan, or a sword, or anything else, if God had not wanted him to die at that point. Now, whether or not he actually died by a snake bite or not is immaterial. This is certainly fine to be taken as a metaphor, with the idea that Hadrian is acknowledging, meaning the rabbis who brought this story together are acknowledging, that ultimately the victory of the Romans and the loss of Bar Kokhba was not just about who was stronger. This is not a weightlifting competition and you get the gold medal by just having more muscle fiber. You win by being the one that God wants to win at that time, because that is who you are and who the people are involved in that scenario. And again, the rabbis are trying to remind us, don't think that Bar Kokhba's mistake was not having enough troops or not having good enough troops. He had the troops. They were good. They lost because God was not with him. God did not want him to win. And by extension, they are implicitly criticizing themselves and the others who supported him that acted like, you know what, if we get enough troops together, we could win. Just that there was no other element involved. And with that, we will pause for today because we don't have time to get through the rest, and we'll pick it up next week. A reminder that next week will be our last class until we get to October, and then we will resume on October 7th. So hopefully everyone has a wonderful week. I will see you all next week. Happen to not see you because you're not here. Well, I'll wish you now a Shana Tova. Have a wonderful good new year. And if you're here with me, I look forward to celebrating with you and reflecting during these Yamim Noraim, days of awe. And if you are not with me, well, then I hope you have a wonderful community that you can share this time with. Take care, everyone, and be well.